Hello everyone. Today, I together with Robin, Yue, and Beizhen will talk about a recent paper titled The Graph Structure of Neural Network. Let's begin with the introduction. During the study of neural network nowadays, it's pretty important to build a relation between a neural network accuracy and its underlying graph structure. Usually, we would like to use computational graph and it look like this. However, it may have some limitation when starting, such as lack of the generality and disconnection with biology and neuroscience field. Thus, in this paper, we would like to develop a new way of representing a neural network, which we call relational graph. And our key insight for this is to focus on the message exchange, and we will discuss more detail in the following slides.
So the key insight here for relational graph is that we want to capture the graphical structure of a neural network. So to define a relational graph, we start with a normal graph, which just have some vertices and edges. So to make it a relational graph, we will associate something called message exchange to this normal graph, as we discussed earlier. So a message exchange will contain the several things. So first, message exchange will happen in several rounds, which each round corresponding with one or several layers of neural networks. So this round of message exchange represents the information flow from one layer to the next layer in an actual neural network. And in order to make this graph, to actually capture the characteristics of a neural network, we need to associate something called feature quantity, which is just a mathematical quantity like a vector, a tensor, or a scalar to each of these nodes so that it actually has some value. And so in order to transform information between these nodes, we will associate with a message function to each of these edges. And in order to combine information from different edges, we will also need an aggregation function. So here, this is a general formulation for the message exchange written in a very concise math equation. So at each round of the message exchange, we basically combines the information from all the other neighboring nodes, and with each node also sending its own quantity or information to the other nodes as well. So this formulation is entirely parallel to the actual mathematical feature of a multi-layer perceptron. So in a multi-layer perceptron, which is the simplest neural network, so we apply a weighting to each of these neurons, and then we sum them together, apply with a nonlinearity to get the feature or the quantity at the next layer. So here, the quantity at neuron is entirely correspondingly or equivalent to the quantity at the node of a relational graph. And this weighting or this multiplication will be our message function in the relational graph. And this summation with nonlinearity in the multi-layer perceptron will be the aggregation function. So here you can see this is entirely parallel. So here are some more practical examples. So on the left, this is a five-layer multi-layer perceptron. And this can be completely transformed into a complete relational graph. So a complete relational graph means that every node is connected to all the other nodes in the graph. And on the right, this is not a fully connected neural network, and this can also be transformed into a relational graph as well. So these are all multi-layer perceptrons with a constant number of neurons at each layers. And of course, we can have more complicated structures. So for example, for MLP with changing number of neurons at each layer, then we need to change this node feature from a scalar quantity to a vector quantity, and from scalar multiplication to matrix multiplication. And in order to study some of the more modern or actual neural networks being used today, like convolution neural network or residual network, then we actually need correspondingly tensor quantity and also convolution. So as you can see here, so with the increasing complexity of the neural networks, the correspondence between the relational graph and neural network will become more complicated. But here, the essence is, for every neural network, we can effectively transform it into a relational graph. And if we are given a relational graph, by clarifying some of its definitions, we can also transform it into a trainable neural network.
Okay, now we need to explore more properties and standards we used on the relational graph. The first one is the graph measures. In this paper, we will use two measures, the average path length, which is the global one, and the clustering coefficient as the local one. To explain clearly, the average path length measures the average shortest path distance between any pair of nodes, and the clustering coefficient measures the proportion of edges between the nodes within a given node's neighborhood, and then divided by the number of edges that could possibly exist between them, with the average over all the nodes. The second one is the graph generator that can generate a device graph to cover a large span of the graph measures. With selected graph measures as variable here, we can try multiple graph generator and figure out the best. Here we have the comparison between the different generator, and we can easily obtain that the WS flat graph here could generate a graph with the wide coverage of the graph measures. So we choose this method in this step. The third one here is the computational budget that we need to control so that all networks have approximately the same complexities. And then the differences in performance are due to their relational graph structure when comparing. Since relational graph structure can be instantiated at the neural network with variable VAS, therefore we can control the VAS of a neural network instead. Then we go to the last step before the experiment, which is the setup. We will use two datasets in this paper. The first one is CFAR10 dataset under the 5-layer perceptron with 512 hidden units. And the second one is the ImageNet classification, and we will use multiple neural networks to construct, such as ResNet34 and other followings. So next, we will discuss the main conclusion in this paper.
Now let's go into the conclusions of this paper. They have concluded several things. First of all, the relationship exists between arrow and the graph structures, and is nearly a smooth function. Also, the paper has concluded that there is a similar graph structure has similar performance. Other than that, it concludes that the top architectures can be identified easily. And lastly, it concludes that the biological networks have some similarity with the artificial networks that has the best performance. Here is the graph about the error rate versus structures. On the 5-layer MLP, which is the graph structure, and the dataset is CIFAR10. This graph that actually demonstrates the concept that graph structure matters. How? Because in the complete graph, which has a clustering coefficient C equals to 1.0 and average path length L equal to 1.0. The complete graph is over here. However, it has a performance lower than, say, a graph over here, which means that the graph is not complete with certain structures will be overperform the complete graph. Also, if we take a look, when we fix one of L or C, for example, in this case, we fix the value of C in between 0.4 and 0.6, and we graph top 1 arrows with L, and the graph is nearly a quadratic curve, which means that the function is pretty smooth. Also, you can see that this one is also a quadratic curve, which means that there's a smooth relationship between the arrows and the variable L and C. Now, instead of focus on a particular dataset, we are going to expand experiment in another dataset and another graph structure. We can observe the consistency among those datasets. One of the consistency concept is quantitative consistency. The quantitative consistency usually means that the conclusion is based on general comparison and with no explicit calculation. And we can see that they use different graph structure such as 5-layer MLP, 8-layer CNN, and couple ResNets. They also select two datasets, CIFAR10 and ImageNet. The first one is pretty easy, and the second one is very challenging. However, across all the datasets and structure, we see the similar heat map. The heat map is created based on the average of the top 1 errors of models fall in the range. Also, there is sweet spots, indicated by the red brackets that usually the best graph is likely to fall in the range. The approximate values for the sweet spots, it's about the C between 0.2 and 0.6, and L is between like 1.5 and 3. Now let's talk about the other concept that is called quantitative consistency. Quantitative consistency means we actually need to do some calculation. So they calculate the correlation. It measures the correlation between the different graph structure name. Say we have like 5-layer MLP and ResNet 34, but similar value of average pass length and clustering coefficients. Well, they did the same thing over and over again, and they plot this chart. And what they find is that the correlation between, even though different graph structures, as long as they have similar average pass lengths and similar clustering coefficients, the Pearson correlation, which shows above the graph, is at least 0.7 or above, which means that there is strong correlation between two different graph structure as long as it has similar clustering coefficients and average pass lengths. So this is the quantitative consistency.
Talk about the remaining two main conclusions. So the first one is what we call the top architecture. So training thousands of original data until convergence might be computationally prohibitive. However, from this experiment, it can be shown that the sweet spot can be identified with much less computational cost, with fewer graphs and for less epochs. So when we are computing the correlation between 52 bin values, that is computed using all 3,942 graphs, and using the subsampled fewer graphs, as shown in the figures on the left-hand side, we can see that the bin values computed using only 52 samples have a really high correlation, which is 0.9. This finding suggests that in practice, much fewer graphs are needed to conduct a similar analysis. For the epochs part, we can see by using the same dataset, we compute the correlation between the validation of the top 1 error, potentially trained modulus, and the validation top 1 error of models trained for full 100 epochs over the 52 sampled relational graphs, as we can see in the right-hand side of the graph. And in this case, we can see that after 3 epochs, we already have a really high correlation, which is 0.93. This indicating that the good relational graph performs well even at the initial training epochs. This finding is important as it indicates that the computational cost to determine if a relational graph is promising can be greatly reduced. Next, we want to talk about some link to the biological neural network. So first, what we found in this paper, in this experiment, is related to network science. The average path length that we measure characterizes how well information is exchanged across the network, which aligns with our definition of relational graph that consists of rounds of message exchange. And the next part we want to talk about is the neuroscience. The best performing relational graphs that we discover surprisingly resembles biological neural networks as shown on the left-hand side of the figures. The similarities we have are in 2 dimensions. The first one we have is that the graph measures, which is L and C, of the top artificial neural networks are highly similar to biological neural networks. And for the second part, with the relational graph representation, it can translate biological neural networks to the 5-layer MLPs. And we found that these networks also outperform the baseline complete graphs. However, throughout the whole experiment, there are some problems with the main conclusions that probably will influence what we have already. Throughout the whole relational graph experiment, we're only using one dataset. And this might influence our result because what we have found might only be one of the features the dataset have. So what we need to do next, afterwards, should be having more datasets using the similar method to see whether we are getting the same result. And that is the end of this presentation.